How did an IQ test ruin my life? The researcher who handed me the results was trying very hard to keep her face neutral, and she was failing. I know this because I had been watching people try to maintain neutral expressions around me for 3 weeks by that point and had gotten reasonably good at detecting the exact moment the training broke down. Her name was Dr. Celine Yilmaz, and she had a PhD from Johns Hopkins and 15 years in cognitive assessment research, and she was sitting across a laminate table from me in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, holding a printout that she kept turning over in her hands without looking at it, and her face was doing something complicated that I recognized later as the expression of a scientist encountering data that does not fit any available framework. I was 17 years old. I had taken the test 4 days earlier because my friend Darius had texted me a flyer about a university research study paying $40 for 2 hours, and I needed the money for a car repair and the timing was convenient. I had expected to sit in a room, answer some questions, collect my $40, and go home. Instead, I was apparently the most interesting thing Dr. Yilmaz had encountered in 15 years of cognitive assessment research, and nobody was telling me why, and the $40 was still sitting in an envelope on the corner of the table, and I had been in the building for 6 hours. I had been working part-time at a hardware store in my hometown for 8 months when this started, stocking shelves 3 evenings a week and Saturdays, saving money in a shoebox under my bed because I did not fully trust banks, and because my mother had lost a modest savings account to a bank error when I was 12, and the shoebox felt like a lesson I had internalized more completely than I understood at the time. My name is Theo, and I was finishing my junior year at a regional high school in the kind of town that people describe as quiet when they mean unremarkable, and I was, by every available measure, an unremarkable student. Not failing. I want to be precise about this because the story requires precision to make sense, but not succeeding in any way that generated documentation or attention. Consistent B-minuses and occasional C-pluses, a record clean of disciplinary incidents, no extracurricular activities that required commitment beyond the minimum, a guidance counselor who knew my name and could pick me out of a lineup, but who had never, to my knowledge, said anything about me to anyone that required more than 2 sentences. My mother worked as a dental hygienist. My father had left when I was 9 and sent Christmas cards with varying degrees of sincerity. I lived a life that was neither hard enough to build character through suffering, nor fortunate enough to create any particular ambition, and I was entirely fine with this, which is perhaps the most honest thing I can say about who I was before the test. Darius had texted me the flyer on a Thursday evening with the message, $40 for answering questions. I'm doing it Saturday morning. Come with me. I went because Darius was my best friend, and because the shoebox under my bed had $340 in it, and my car needed a new alternator that was going to cost $280, and the math was straightforward. The research building was a low structure on the edge of the university campus, clean and institutional, and the study coordinator who checked us in was a graduate student named Petra, who gave us both consent forms and bottled water, and explained that we were participating in a study on cognitive assessment methodology. Darius and I were put in separate rooms. I sat down in front of a testing booklet and a Scantron sheet and started working through the problems. The first section was spatial reasoning, patterns and shapes and sequences, and it felt like a more elaborate version of the kind of logic puzzle I did sometimes when my phone died and I was bored. The second section was verbal reasoning, analogies and definitions and reading comprehension. The third was numerical. I worked through it without rushing and without struggling, the way I moved through most things in my life, steadily, without particular enthusiasm or particular difficulty, finishing because stopping would require an explanation I didn't have. I handed in my test at 11:23 a.m., according to the clock on the wall, and went to the waiting room to find Darius, and instead found Petra looking at her phone with a very specific expression that I did not yet have the context to read correctly. Darius did not emerge from his room for another 55 minutes. I sat in the waiting room reading a 3-year-old magazine about sustainable agriculture and occasionally checking my own phone. Nobody came to give me my $40. At 12:18 p.m., Dr. Celine Yilmaz appeared in the waiting room doorway and introduced herself and asked if I would mind answering a few follow-up questions in a separate room, and I said sure because I had nothing else to do, and because she offered me a second bottled water. The follow-up questions were not questions at all. They were another test. A different version, she said, to verify some of the initial results. I said okay and did it, and it felt similar to the first one, and I finished it in 38 minutes and handed it in. Dr. Yilmaz took it and disappeared. I waited again. The second time she came back, she had 2 other people with her. A man I later learned was a statistician named Dr. Kofi Mensah, who had been called in from another building, and a woman in a blazer who introduced herself only as Dr. Park and did not offer a first name or an affiliation, and the 3 of them sat across from me and the laminate table and the envelope with my $40, and Dr. Yilmaz said they needed to tell me something about my results. The score was 162. On the Stanford Binet, which is the test I had apparently taken, This placed me in a category that Dr. Mensah described as profoundly gifted, which was a clinical term I had not encountered before, and which he defined as a score occurring in approximately 1 in 30,000 people. He said this with the careful steadiness of a man who had checked the number multiple times before entering the room. Dr. Yilmaz said they had rescored the test manually to rule out errors. Dr. Park said nothing but wrote something in a notebook. I sat there looking at the three of them and felt nothing in particular, which I think surprised all of us. I did not feel validated or excited or revealed. I felt mildly confused in the way I felt when a news story turned out to be more complicated than the headline suggested, and I asked whether this affected the $40, and Dr. Mensah laughed in a way that was half relief and half something else, and Dr. Yilmaz pushed the envelope across the table and said no, the $40 was absolutely still mine. The problem began not with the score itself, but with what the score did to the people around me once it became known. I told my mother that evening. I expected her to be pleased in the routine way parents are pleased by good news from their children, a warm acknowledgement followed by a return to the ordinary rhythms of the evening. Instead, she went very still at the kitchen table, in a way I had never seen her go still before. And then she asked me to repeat the number, and then she called my Aunt Claudia in Philadelphia and talked to her for 45 minutes while I ate dinner and listened to her voice carrying through the wall, moving through various registers of excitement and uncertainty, and something that sounded, though I might have been wrong, like fear. The call to my guidance counselor came 3 days later, apparently from Dr. Yilmaz's office directly. And this was the first thing that happened in a sequence of things I had not authorized and could not stop. My guidance counselor was a man named Mr. Obi Adesanya, who had worked at the school for 11 years and who I had interacted with twice before, once when I chose my sophomore electives and once when I turned in a tardy slip, and who appeared in the doorway of my English class on a Wednesday morning and asked me to come to his office, and who looked at me across his desk with an expression that contained more layers than I had previously believed his face capable of. The expression was the first red flag I registered but could not yet interpret. Mr. Adesanya had always been pleasant to me in the generic way of school administrators managing a large caseload, and the face he was making was not generic. It was the face of someone who had just received information that required him to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about a situation, and who was simultaneously trying not to show that recalibration because showing it would require explaining why it was necessary. He asked me about the test results, and I confirmed them. He said he wanted to support me in exploring what this might mean for my educational trajectory. I said, okay. He said he was going to reach out to some resources. He said it in the way people say things when they have already decided what they are going to do and are describing it as a collaborative process as a courtesy. I went back to English class and thought about the alternator, which had been successfully replaced and which my car was running fine on. And I did not think about the conversation with Mr. Adesanya again until the following Monday, when I discovered that he had contacted the state's gifted education coordinator without telling me, and that the gifted education coordinator had begun a process that I had not initiated, and that was apparently going to require my ongoing participation, regardless of whether I wanted to provide it. The gifted education coordinator was a woman named Miriam Nkosi, and she arrived at our school the following Thursday with a file folder and a very organized agenda. She had been coordinating gifted programs across the district for 9 years and had a manner that was both warm and inexorable, the manner of someone who genuinely wanted good things for you and was going to pursue those good things with or without your active cooperation. She met with me for an hour in a conference room that also contained Mr. Adesanya and, unexpectedly, my mother, who had been invited without my knowledge and who had driven directly from her morning shift still in her work scrubs. Miriam laid out a plan that involved transferring me to an accelerated program at a magnet school 20 miles away, beginning in the fall semester, which was 3 months away. The plan also involved retesting, additional assessments, meetings with a cognitive specialist, and a review of my academic records going back to 4th grade to identify what the plan document called early indicators of suppressed giftedness. I listened to all of this and felt the specific cold feeling of watching something be decided in a room you are physically present in but are not actually part of. I asked whether I had a choice. Miriam said, of course, that my participation in any program was voluntary. My mother looked at me with an expression that said, please don't. I did not want to go to the magnet school. I want to be clear about this because later I was told, in various ways and by various people, that not wanting to go was itself evidence of something: suppressed potential, institutional trauma, low academic self-concept, a failure to properly value opportunity, and I want to register for the record that I simply did not want to leave my school, my friends, and the hardware store job that I had built into a routine I found genuinely satisfying, in order to attend an institution I had not chosen for reasons I did not accept. The score on a test I had taken for $40 was not sufficient justification, in my view, for restructuring my entire life around it. This view was shared by almost no one I encountered in the following months, which was when things began to get complicated in ways that exceeded ordinary complications. The first complication was my mother. She had grown up in circumstances that made educational opportunity feel like something that could be taken from you, and the idea that her son had been identified as gifted and was declining to act on it produced in her a distress that was real and that I genuinely did not want to cause. We had 3 conversations in 2 weeks that each covered the same ground from different angles and ended in the same place, with her saying that she just wanted me to have every opportunity and me saying that I was not sure this was an opportunity I wanted, and neither of us finding a resolution. The second complication was Dr. Yilmaz, who called me at home twice to ask if I would be willing to participate in a follow-up study that she said would help her research on cognitive assessment in under-identified populations. I said I would think about it. The third complication was larger and arrived without warning, which is how the largest complications usually arrive. A local journalist named Francesca Obasi, who wrote for the regional paper and covered the education beat, published a story on a Thursday in late April with the headline, "Local Teens Test Score Among Highest Ever Recorded in State." I had not spoken to Francesca Obasi. Mr. Adesanya had not spoken to Francesca Obasi. My mother had not spoken to Francesca Obasi. Dr. Yilmaz's institution had a press office, and the press office had issued a brief statement about exceptional findings in an ongoing research study, and Francesca Obasi had found my name, I do not know how, I still do not know how, and published it alongside the score and a description of my academic history that she had apparently obtained from sources I could not identify. The story described me as a hidden genius overlooked by a failing system. It used my school photo from the yearbook without my permission. It ran on the front page of the Thursday edition and was on the paper's website by 7 a.m. and had been shared 3,400 times by noon. My phone, which I had left on the kitchen counter when I left for school that morning, had 156 notifications by the time I checked it during lunch. I will compress the following 6 weeks because describing them in full would take longer than I have, and also because the compression is its own kind of accuracy. What happened in those 6 weeks? My school became a place I could not move through normally because every teacher and most of my classmates had read the article and had formed opinions about it that they felt entitled to share with me directly. Darius told me he was not sure how to act around me anymore, which was the most painful single sentence of the entire period. A woman who described herself as a talent consultant for exceptional young people left a voicemail at my mother's number 3 times in 1 week. The magnet school sent an application packet addressed to me personally. A university in a city 600 miles away sent a letter about early admission possibilities. My mother printed out the article and kept it on the refrigerator with a magnet that said, "Home is where the heart is." And I stopped sleeping properly, which meant I was making errors at work, which meant my manager Dwayne, a retired contractor who ran the hardware store with the patience of someone who had seen everything, sat me down one Friday afternoon and asked, with genuine concern and no drama, what was going on with me. I told Dwayne most of it. He listened without interrupting, which was how Dwayne did everything, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you actually want?" I said I wanted everyone to stop deciding things about my life based on a number they had assigned to me. He said that was clear, and asked what I wanted to do about it. I said I did not know. He said that not knowing was fine, but that knowing would be useful, and that in his experience the most effective thing a person could do when a system was trying to process them into a category they had not chosen was to generate a counter-narrative that was more specific than the system's narrative. I wrote that down in my phone because it was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in 6 weeks. The professional who helped me understand what generating a counter-narrative actually required was a woman named Dr. Amara Osei, who was a licensed psychologist specializing in educational rights and cognitive assessment ethics, and who I found through a legal aid organization that provided free consultations for families dealing with school system disputes. Dr. Osei had 20 years of experience and had testified in 4 cases involving schools misusing assessment data. And she sat across from me and my mother in a consultation room and asked very specific questions about the timeline of events following my test. And when she had asked all of them, she said that several things had happened that were not legal. The disclosure of my test results to the school without my written consent was a FERPA violation. The publication of my name alongside my score by the journalist, obtained through channels that Dr. Yilmaz's institution had not properly restricted, was a potential HIPAA-adjacent issue in the context of a research study. The school's pressure to transfer programs without formal written documentation of my rights and my options was an administrative process violation. She said none of these things individually would constitute a major case, but together they painted a picture of a series of institutions that had treated my cognitive assessment data as public property rather than private information, and that this was a pattern worth addressing formally. She asked whether I wanted to pursue it. My mother said yes before I finished the sentence. The attorney Dr. Osei referred us to was a man named Kwame Forson, who had been practicing education law for 18 years and who had a specific and undisguised frustration with what he called the gifted industrial complex. His phrase, delivered with the dry precision of someone who had used it many times and still found it accurate. He reviewed the timeline Dr. Osei had documented and sent formal letters to the school district's legal department, to Dr. Yilmaz's institution, and to the newspaper. The letter to the newspaper was the one that moved fastest. It cited the unauthorized use of my school photograph, obtained from the yearbook without my consent or my family's consent, and the publication of my name alongside research data in a way that violated the study's consent protocols. Francesca Obasi called my mother's phone within 24 hours of the letter being delivered. The call lasted 11 minutes, and my mother's voice remained at a consistent volume throughout, which meant she was being very controlled, which was its own kind of signal. The newspaper ran a clarification 4 days later that was technically a correction. It acknowledged that the publication of my name had occurred through an error in their verification process, and that the original article had not followed standard protocols for identifying minors in research contexts. The clarification did not appear on the front page. It appeared on page 8, in the section where corrections traditionally lived, below a correction about a miscaptioned photo of a local bridge. Kwame said this was about as good as we were going to get from the newspaper in the short term, and that what mattered more was the documentation trail we were building, which would matter if we chose to pursue anything further. I asked what further might mean. He said it might mean a formal complaint to the state education board about the school district's handling of my assessment data, which could result in the district revising its procedures for handling gifted identification cases going forward. He said it was not a path for people who wanted quick outcomes, but that it was a path for people who wanted structural change rather than individual resolution. I said I wanted to think about it. He said, take your time. The crisis arrived on a Monday in May, 6 weeks after the article ran, when I came home from school to find 2 things on the kitchen table. The first was a letter from the magnet school with a deadline for enrollment responses that was 5 days away. The second was a printout from a national news website that had picked up Francesca Obasi's original story and republished it with new framing. The headline was, America's Most Overlooked Genius? And it had my name and my school photo and a quote attributed to an unnamed source at my school describing my academic history in ways that made me sound more tragic and more exceptional than either was accurate. The national story had 140,000 shares by the time I found it. My phone, which I had started keeping on silent, showed 47 missed calls and text notifications. One of them was from a television producer. One of them was from a man claiming to be a distant relative. One of them was from Darius, which said simply, Theo, I'm sorry I didn't know it would get this big. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The enrollment deadline was 5 days away. The national story was circulating. My mother was at work. The shoebox under my bed had $680 in it, which was more than it had ever had, and the alternator was running fine, and in 4 months I was supposed to be a senior at a school where I had lived for 3 years, and where I knew which bathroom had the working hot water, and which teacher let you eat in her classroom during free periods, and which exit got you to the parking lot fastest after last bell. All of that was on one side of a decision that had been made without my consent and was being accelerated by a system that had decided, based on a number, that I was something I had not agreed to be. I opened my phone and called Kwame Forson at 4:47 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, and I told him I wanted to pursue the formal complaint. He said he was glad to hear it and asked me to come in on Wednesday. Kwame filed the formal complaint with the State Education Board on a Friday in June, 2 weeks after the national story ran, and 3 weeks before school let out for the summer. The complaint documented 4 specific violations: the unauthorized disclosure of assessment data to the school without written consent, the school's failure to provide written documentation of my rights under the identification process, the press office's failure to maintain research subject confidentiality in communications with media, and the school's pattern of applying pressure to transfer programs without formal acknowledgement of the voluntary nature of participation. Kwame filed supporting documentation including the original consent form I had signed for the research study, which notably did not authorize disclosure to educational institutions, and the timeline Dr. Osei had constructed, which showed the sequence of events following the test with dates and sources. He also attached a written statement from me that I had spent a week drafting and that I want to summarize here, because the drafting of it was the first time I understood what I actually thought about what had happened to me. The statement said, a number produced by a single test on a single morning was treated as a complete and sufficient description of who I am. Institutions that had no prior investment in my life or my choices decided, based on that number, that they had the authority to redirect my life without my participation in the decision. When I declined to cooperate with that redirection, the absence of cooperation was treated as a failure on my part, rather than a legitimate exercise of my own judgment. The score may be accurate. I cannot evaluate the methodology of an instrument I have no expertise in. What I can evaluate is the claim that a high score on a cognitive test creates an obligation to institutions, to a concept of potential, to the expectations of strangers, and I am not convinced that claim is correct. My life is not a resource to be managed by people who discovered it through a flyer offering $40. It is mine. I would like it back. The State Education Board's response came 8 weeks later, in August, addressed to Kwame's office. It acknowledged the complaint, noted that the assessment data disclosure had occurred outside proper FERPA protocols, and directed the school district to revise its procedures for handling third-party assessment data for all students, not just those in gifted identification processes. The board also requested that Dr. Yilmaz's institution provide documentation of their press communication protocols and submit to a review of their consent procedures for studies involving minors. The newspaper was not within the board's jurisdiction and was addressed separately through a separate complaint Kwame filed with the state press standards body, which resulted in a formal finding that the publication of a minor's name in conjunction with medical research data without proper consent verification did not meet the organization's ethical standards for reporting on minors. The finding was published on the standards body's website and sent to the newspaper's editorial board. Francesca Obasi's byline disappeared from the paper's education section for approximately 3 months. I do not know what that indicates about what happened inside the newsroom, and I have decided not to speculate. The magnet school deadline passed. I enrolled as a senior at my own school in September. I was assigned to Mr. Adesanya's guidance caseload, which meant we had to interact occasionally, and those interactions were civil and unremarkable, which I considered a reasonable outcome. The research study at the university concluded without me as a follow-up participant, which Dr. Yilmaz communicated through a letter to my mother that was formal and slightly sad in a way that I think was genuine. She was, I believe, a person who cared about her research and was disappointed that the circumstances had made continued participation impossible, and I held no particular feeling about this one way or another. Dr. Osei testified at the State Education Board hearing in November as an expert witness on assessment data handling, using a version of my case as an anonymized example of systemic process failures, and sent me a note afterwards saying that the testimony had been well received and that she was hopeful for procedural changes in the district. Darius and I worked things out over the summer, slowly and without a formal conversation about it, the way friendships repair themselves when both people are willing to wait and neither needs the repair to be announced. He got a job at the gas station on Route 9, and I was still at the hardware store, and we ate lunch together on Saturdays when our schedules aligned and talked about nothing important, which was what we had always done, and which turned out to be sufficient. My mother took the article off the refrigerator in July. She replaced it with a photo from a camping trip we had taken the previous summer, before any of this happened, in which both of us are squinting into the sun and looking roughly equally annoyed and roughly equally fine. I noticed the change and did not comment on it, and neither did she, which was its own kind of resolution. I graduated in June the following year. I enrolled at the Regional Community College in the fall, in a computer science program that interested me for reasons that had nothing to do with any test score. I had been learning to code from YouTube videos since I was 14, and had recently fixed a software problem in the hardware store's inventory system that Dwayne had been paying someone $200 a year to manage. And this had clarified for me that useful competence, developed independently and applied to real problems, was more interesting to me than any official designation of what I was supposed to be capable of. Dwayne offered to write me a letter of recommendation for the program that described the inventory fix in detail. I used it. The admissions officer who reviewed my application noted in her feedback that it was one of the more specific letters she had received and asked me to tell her more about the project in my interview. I told her about it for 20 minutes. She offered me a place in the program with a partial scholarship. The number from the Stanford Binet test was not mentioned once in the entire process.